Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by neelib.com. We are dealing with the Japanese history, which comes under IB History SL as a part of paper 1, and we are looking at the causes of Japanese expansionism. And in that, we have already covered a major part about the reasons why Japan had this thing called the Meiji Restoration, and now we are looking at the kind of challenges and the kind of conflicts that Meiji Restoration had faced when it tried to expand the Japanese territory for the sake of its imperialism and for the sake of its establishment as an important rival power to European powers. In that, we are now going to cover firstly the First Sino-Japanese War as the first major conflict that comes in as a part of that entire idea of the Meiji to restore themselves to former glory and greatness. So Japan had a long history of association with China that's dating back to 500 to 600 CE, when the Chinese writing and culture were more widely disseminated by way of Korea. So Korea is another country that is playing a very important role in this kind of a connection, a neighboring country that's playing an important role. During the 19th century, China was weakened by its defeat in both the Opium Wars with Britain and by being forced into a series of unequal treaties by European powers. Korea lay between Japan and China, and as Japan emerged in the new age of militarization, it aimed to establish its control of the Korean peninsula. So clearly, Japan is trying to expand its power, and just like all European countries are moving into Asia and are moving into Africa, Japan is trying to first take care of its neighbors, like occupying those areas. Inevitably, this would bring Japan into direct conflict with China, which used to see Korea as its own tributary state. So Korea is coveted by both Japan and China at this juncture. In 1894, an uprising in Korea prompted its government to ask for assistance from China, but Japan sent troops before the Chinese army arrived, leading to then a conflict between the two armies, China and Japan, fighting in Korea in the name of the Korean protection. Ian Buruma argues that at the heart of this conflict was the question of which army had modernized most effectively. So was it that China, which is already facing a lot of trouble at home and outside, or is it the Japanese army which seems to have restored itself? And accordingly, which country would then dominate East Asia? Japan proved its dominance by pushing the Chinese back across the Yalu River and the border between Korea and China, while its navy secured victory in the Yellow Sea. So clearly in this round, Japan was able to prove its dominance. The ensuing treaty of Shimonoseki affirmed Chinese recognition of the Korean independence, and the cession of Formosa, which is now today known as Taiwan, and additionally the Liaodong Peninsula and the Pescadores Islands to Japan. So all of these places, including modern-day Taiwan, were given to Japan by China. China also granted commercial and trading rights to Japan. So exactly what was done to the Japanese by the Americans, which is this kind of a forced demand for rights or trading rights, that is something that Japan then does to China subsequently. In Japan, this victory was seen as a confirmation of Japanese superiority over China. Now, you don't need to be a geographer in order to understand the kind of absolute euphoria and confidence that the Japanese must have felt for having brought China to its knees. If you look at the kind of geographical expansion of the two countries, you are probably absolutely clear about how big a victory this must have been for the Japanese. And they are now very clearly happy that this has cemented their status as the higher civilization between the Japanese and the Chinese. According to Buruma, this signaled a new epoch in Japanese history and confirmed the popular belief that Japan was now equal to Western powers, living up the Meiji slogan of a rich country, strong army. So that's the kind of nationalistic slogan which the Meijis are working, and it's very clearly that this rich country and strong army kind of notion is now instilling in them a great sense of not only patriotism but also nationalism, that we as a country are very, very strong. Victory led to new tensions, however, as Russia now also wanted to control Korea and the Liaodong Peninsula, which China had given up to Japan in this case, but now Russia also wants that kind of a support. So this is a very powerful, like all geographies in the world actually, this is a very conflict-prone area. Under pressure from Britain, France and the United States, Japan was persuaded to relinquish the Liaodong Peninsula. So they were persuaded to give up despite having got it through the Chinese fair and square, they were persuaded to give it up. An act that so many Japanese nationalists proved Japan was still regarded as inferior to the Western powers despite its military prowess. So this kind of a whole idea that we got it and yet we had to give it up because some other countries asked for it. And the center of this problem, according to these Japanese nationalists, was not so much the countries that asked them to give it up, but was the country for whom this was done. In this case, Russia. So obviously, the next conflict that we will look at in terms of the Japanese then is going ahead with going ahead with a war against Russia. So this gives rise to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. The outcome of the First Sino-Japanese War displeased Russia as it wanted to secure its own interests in Manchuria and Korea. In 1898, Russia had secured permission from China to extend the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok, as well as to build the South Manchurian Railway. Furthermore, it had also secured a 20-year lease on the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, all of which led to worsening relations with Japan. So, Russia continues to go ahead and plan its expansion with China despite Japan getting access to all these conquered territories. Japan signed an Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902. This stated that both Britain and Japan would maintain the status quo in the Far East, and one party would remain neutral in a conflict unless the other was attacked by more than one power. Efforts to negotiate an agreement with Russia, whereby Russia would recognize Japanese interests in Korea and Japan the interests of Russia and Manchuria, failed. So the kind of direct conversation between Russia and Japan fails, and the Japanese Navy attacked the Russian Pacific Fleet on 8th of February 1904, declaring war on 10th of February. The war was fought both on land and sea, with the sinking of the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Tsushima Straits probably being one of the most memorable events in this 9-month conflict that ended in October of 1905. Famously, this turned out not to be the splendid little war anticipated by Tsar Nicholas II. With the sinking of the ship, it was very clear that the Japanese have an upper hand in this conflict. And it made Japan a major player now in Far East. Under the terms of the Treaty of Portsmouth, negotiated by the US President Theodore Roosevelt, Japan acquired South Sakhalin, the leasehold over the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, as well as control over the South Manchurian Railway. So Japanese, they get away with all the major demands that the Russians originally had as a result of the ending of this conflict. Russia also recognized Japanese interests in Korea, which became a protectorate of Japan in 1906 and a colony in 1910. So what is the difference between a protectorate and a colony? A protectorate, you cannot demand certain things out of it. The pretense is that you're protecting them for their interests. A colony is a full-on exploitation. You're very clear that they are supposed to provide for you. So you get provided in your own metropolis, and Korea initially becomes a protectorate. That means they are being protected, but later on it eventually ends up being a colony. As with the European powers at this time, nationalism was boosted by imperialism. Japan's foreign policy was extremely successful in expanding its interests in Korea and Manchuria, but inevitably this aroused a mixed response in the international scene. So if you remember our syllabus conversation in one of the previous videos, it's very important to look at the international response as well, because the expansion is not happening in vacuum. It's a result of the constant engagement within these factors, be it within Japan or be it outside of Japan. So the international versus the Japanese factors are very, very important to be kept in mind. If you look at the sources, because again this paper is essentially a source paper, so if you look at this source, which is source C, it is a very interesting source wherein you can see Theodore Roosevelt, who's trying to settle the conversation between the Japanese and the Chinese. It's also very interesting to look at them from the perspective of the fact that this is actually in fact a French cartoon which is being published in such a way. So you are expected to of course write about the message of the cartoon, and you are expected to write about the key details which are there present in this cartoon. So the Meiji era came to an end with the death of the emperor. So remember, his name was Meiji. So obviously, with his end comes the ending of the era in 1911. Emperor Meiji was succeeded by his son Prince Yoshihito, who became Emperor Taisho. So Yoshihito was his name as a child. He eventually gains the name Emperor Taisho. And the Meiji era gave way to the Taisho era then. So instead of the Meiji Emperor, you now have Taisho, which simply means an era of great righteousness. So the name that he takes up as the emperor means the great righteous person, and that's why the era is also called the era of great righteousness. Japan had seemingly become a successful modern empire with a modern army, a constitution, and a democracy of sorts. After all, it has a bicameral legislature. It has these members who are advising the emperor. It has all these other aspects of modernity, such as a constitution, which, if you remember, was gifted to the people by the emperor. So all of these things very clearly show that this aspiration to be a Western power is now being in fact met with the presence of these certain tick boxes, if you will, or check boxes, if you will, in order to understand and accept democracy of a sort. There were, however, indications that the changes were in fact only superficial. Underneath this veneer of modernization, Japan remained deeply traditional. So, all the power that the Tokugawa clan had as a part of the shogun merely translates to the emperor now. Earlier, the Meiji, and now the Taisho era. So it remains a very traditional society. While there might be other constitution, while there might be a constitution, there might be like representatives in the national diet, all of that translates essentially to a tradition of having a cult of personality, which earlier was there for the Tokugawa clan, has now shifted to the emperor. And with political power entrenched in the emperor and his circle of advisors, freedom of expression, for instance, was severely limited, and political ideas such as socialism and demands for greater equality for women were swiftly suppressed. So it remains a very patriarchal, closed society, a very traditional society, despite these markers of so called Western influence and so called Western civilizational narrative. In August 1914, so August 1914, just to establish the international context in a minute, the end of August of 1914 is seen as the beginning of the Great War. Alright, while it begins with the finishing of the ultimatum on July 28th, 1914, it is only in August that you start seeing the actual movement of several multiple armies. Now, all of that is happening in Europe. Do remember that, because it's essentially an argument or a fight between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Serbians. But very soon, several countries start taking sides. So Serbians are joined by a certain number of forces and the Austro-Hungarians are joined by a number of forces. It's because of this kind of a mixture of multiple countries that various European colonies get involved. So colony like India, even though it had nothing to do with the war which is happening so far away, still it joined because Britain joined the war effort. Similarly, a country like Japan, which is so far away, may not be very interested, but because Russia joins in the war, there might be serious recognition of the fact that we also need to take a stand in this war, which is essentially someone else's war. It's happening in Europe, has no concern. But you did get involved in the war either because your enemy was fighting or because the metropolis to which you belonged as a colony, they were fighting the war. So in August 1914, almost immediately after the outbreak of World War I in Europe, World War I is a name that comes subsequently, back then it was called the Great War, Japan, in keeping with the spirit of the 1902 alliance with Britain. So in this case, not so much because of the enemy, but because they have an alliance with Britain. That it had signed with Britain, those not strictly necessary as the latter had not been attacked by two powers, declared war on Germany. So it's very convenient that you end up declaring war on Germany, because at the end of the day, you are trying to then think of, other alliances as well as you think through this entire narrative. Because do remember that the Russian Tsar is also against Germany, and the Russian Tsar is your enemy. Initially was your enemy just 7 years ago. So how will you manage all of these relations? How will you manage this kind of animosity? Will you sit now with an older enemy as your friend, because both of you have a common enemy? So all of this adds to the chaotic mix of Japanese international relations at this moment. This was not entirely altruistic, so it's not only being done for Britain, please understand, as the war offered opportunities for Japan to stand in for Britain in the Far East. So conquering lands, but in the name of Britain. So, especially in the Far East. So you can do whatever you want to do independently if you wish to, but you have to do it in the name of the alliance and as a protector, as a friendly protector of Britain. And in particular, to take over the German leased territory in the Shandong province of China. So you are anti-Germany now, so you have every right to take over whatever Germany had in China. Now you have a legitimate reason to do that. The Japanese army moved quickly to surround the German port of Tsingtao and after a 2-month siege received its surrender. Similarly, German colonies in the Pacific surrendered without many casualties. When the Allied powers asked for Japanese troops to be sent to Europe, however, the request was denied. So when they actually needed the soldiers, the reason why you joined the war you said you joined the war in August 1914 to support Britain, to take care of Britain as a part of the alliance of 1902, when the soldiers were asked, it was completely declined. So it's very clear that at the end of the day, they are only doing it for their own sake and for their own expansion. Although some destroyers were sent to act as convoy escorts in the Mediterranean. In 1915, Japan imposed what became known as 21 demands on China, insisting on the following concessions. Number one, that German interests in China be transferred to Japan. So everything that belongs to Germany in China goes to Japan. Number two, the Japanese interests in Manchuria be recognized. And this will be a bone of contention for conflicts for the next few decades, right up till the Second World War. So that's very interesting that it begins here in the context of the First Great War, and that Japan be given an increased role in the administration and policing of China. So all this hunger for China has its origin, has its roots in the First World War. These demands reflected not only Japanese ambition but also Chinese weakness during this period of warlordism. That is something that we'll cover as a part of our paper 2 topics, and weak central government. American and British support helped China to resist some of the more aggressive demands to share its governance, but the territorial demands were in fact conceded. So the territorial demands that all of this territory shall be policed, shall be administered by the Japanese, this had to be accepted despite the kind of support that the Americans and the British were giving to the Chinese. To some extent, this backfired on Japan as it aroused Chinese nationalism as well as American suspicions that Japan would seize an opportunity to impose its influence over China. Indeed, when civil war broke out in Russia in 1918, in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, Japan sent soldiers to Siberia to halt the progress of the Red Army. So Japan was in fact a very active member of the White Army in order to stop the Red Army. So anything to protect, in fact anything to save itself or anything to save the enemy country becoming united, that is something that the Japanese don't like. So if China gets a rise of nationalism, the Japanese will be against that. Similarly, if Russia is getting strengthened under the Bolshevik army, the Japanese would send forces as a part of the opposing army so that its interests in Russia can be maintained. Though again, idea that the text wants to convey to us is the fact that this in fact had the opposite impact. The fact that an enemy like Japan was present helped the Chinese get united against that enemy. So despite having their own problems, they ended up getting united against the Japanese enemy. The United States also sent the soldiers with the intention of maintaining a limited eastern front against Germany and limiting Japanese gains. So what happens then in the Paris Peace Conference? So this Japan, this conflictual Japan, this kind of a country that is really only hell-bent on expanding, and this doesn't seem to have changed much with the change of emperors. So while the Meiji emperor went away in 1911, even in the Taisho era, the same kind of hunger seems to be occupying the Japanese territorial ambition. So what happens then in that context of the Paris Peace Conference? The Paris Peace Conference is the ending of the Great War. So let's see the role of Japan in the Paris Peace Conference. An armistice. So armistice is simply the surrendering of weapons. When you give up fighting, it's called an armistice. So an armistice ended World War I in November 1918. On the 11th of November 1918, it ended. It was followed by the Paris Peace Conference, during which Japanese delegation sought occupation of the following German colonies in the North Pacific. So Japan argued that everything that belonged to Germany in the North Pacific, which is the area closest to them geographically, it should belong to Japan. And this is very similar to the kind of European demands over Germany and over German colonies in Africa and Asia. All the European countries wanted German colonies from separate areas in Africa to belong to them, depending on how close their earlier colonies were to the Japanese colonies. So similarly, Japan is also demanding the same thing, that in North Pacific, whatever belongs to Germany should now belong to us. These areas were the Mariana, Marshall and Caroline Islands. One even greater importance to its foreign policy was Japan's request to take over German interests in the Shandong province. So again, the German interests in China, again the Japanese want those, as had been outlined in the 21 demands. In China, the May 4th movement of 1919 protested vehemently against such a violation of the principle of self-determinism. So while the Treaty of Versailles is promising self-determination, that is the kind of freedom to European powers, China's self-determination is being taken away and might be given to Japan. For US President Woodrow Wilson, who is the leading authority in the Paris Peace Conference, whether to accede to Japan's demands or champion those of the Chinese was amongst the most difficult of the dilemmas he faced at the conference. So he is not very sure of what step to take. Whether to champion the Chinese demands or the Japanese demands, he's very unclear. Even though technically he should have been on China's side because self-determination is his idea. He has brought it to the Paris Peace Conference. Japan did get the Shandong province, but this decision was influenced by another event linked to the establishment of the League of Nations. A number of people, including Prince Knoi Fumimaro, a member of the Japanese delegation, were critical of the concept of the League, an organization that was believed to preserve the economic and political supremacy of the Western powers. So Japan pushes for the racial angle in this entire discussion, that that if you want us to feel as empowered as you are feeling, you better give us the territories as well. Not of course very hypocritically ignoring the fact that they themselves are then playing worse powers by taking over and thinking of taking over Chinese provinces. If you genuinely believe that Asians should be as superior, then why are you conquering another Asian land? And the prince also railed against the racism inherent in the attitudes of the British and the Americans, who seemed to consider Japan, despite its military prowess, to be a second class power. In particular, Japan was deeply offended by the treatment of the Japanese immigrants to the United States and now demanded that the League should support racial equality. So that's the push that they're giving, that there should be racial equality. But mind you, racial equality only amongst the winners. No racial equality amongst those who have lost the war. And in 1919, this was considered incendiary, as it would have immediate repercussions in European colonies in Africa and Asia, as well as threatening the Australian white-only immigration policy. Japan lost the debate and the racial equality clause was shelved. So for the sake of the Western powers, this was something that was not accepted and the racial equality clause was shelved. And this of course will cause a lot of trouble in Japan in the subsequent years. Japan will carry this as a badge of honor that they stood for racial equality in the original discussions of the League of Nations, but were completely ignored by the Western powers. President Wilson was also feared that denying Japan its claim on Shandong might result in Japan leaving the conference and refusing to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and Wilson couldn't have it. Wilson wanted the maximum number of countries to sign the Treaty of Versailles. It's only a pity and it's a weird thing of how fates work that the only country that didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles was his own country. That US decided to sit out of the Treaty of Versailles, but he wanted all the other countries to sign up the Treaty of Versailles, including his own, but that's a separate story for another day. But Japan, because he wanted the Japanese signature so desperately, he was ready to give up Shandong for that. It was a risk. The fact that Japanese were ready to leave was a risk that he was not prepared to take. So Japan gained Shandong, but as Margaret Macmillan, she was an academic at the University of Oxford. She notes it was not an easy decision for Wilson, who complained to his doctor, "Last night I could not sleep. My mind was so full of Japanese-Chinese controversy." This has been noted in a book called Paris 1919. The Paris Conference and the Treaty of Versailles were followed by the Washington Conference of 1920, 21, 22, giving rise to the term Versailles-Washington system to describe the new international order that had been organized to protect the interests of the two major victorious powers, Great Britain and United States. So Versailles representing the Great British side, which is the European side, even though Versailles is in France, but Washington's system so that the American interests are also protected, which were not being represented at the League of Nations because America is not a part of the League of Nations. The outcome of the conference resulted in a sense of increasing disillusionment in Japan and a deepening of its inferiority complex for the following reasons. So all of these other European transatlantic powers gaining some sort of a bonhomie, them gaining some sort of a friendship, seems to be a major problem for Japan. It feels very isolated, it feels very separated, and it feels very questioned, despite, by the way, its military expansion. So there is a lot of expansion that's happening, but it doesn't seem to be getting them a table at the world affairs. And that's a great challenge for Japan. It confirmed the end of Anglo-Japanese alliance with it and with it the loss of Japanese control over Shandong. So the fact that US and Britain together have signed an alliance shows that Japan is no longer a wanted ally of Britain, and definitely it also meant the loss of Japanese control over Shandong, because that was something that was ensured by Britain so far. It required the withdrawal of Japanese troops from Siberia as well. So another region that they had controlled for so long, now they are out of it. And it imposed a 5-5-3 ratio in battleships between Britain, United States and Japan. So if Britain has 5 battleships and US has 5 battleships, Japan is only allowed to have 3, thus limiting the size of Japanese fleet in relation to that of other two Western powers. So this was a great slap in the face of Japanese modernization and expansion, that even their expansion cannot happen at their own terms and conditions. Even that shall be taken care of, or shall be done with the help of American and British acceptance. This was not all. In 1922, the Nine-Part Treaty liquidated all existing treaties between the powers and China and replaced them with the open door principles so long espoused by the United States. So even China, where there seemed to have been some sort of a control that Japan had got, especially after the Great War, even they were taken away, because a new treaty is signed in 1922, whose first clause is that everything that came before this treaty is now being liquidated. So all the Japanese authority that they had enjoyed in China for so long, just with the help of one piece of paper, a new treaty of 1922, it completely goes out of the window. So Japan again finds itself completely isolated, completely questioned as a power in terms of a military power. And remember, how do you explain these? Not so much for the international angle, but how do you explain these losses to the military that you are training at home, calling it and telling it again and again that the great emperor is going to rule the world? So it is that dissonance, it is that kind of a break of that narrative, the nationalistic narrative, the fervor that you are actually firing up in your home, versus the kind of reality that you are seeing in international affairs between 1919 and 1922. This cognitive dissonance is what will formulate the future of Japan and the way Japanese choose to go ahead and expand, ignoring the League of Nations at a later date. Further, limits on the Japanese Navy would be imposed at the 1930 London Conference, when a 10-10-6 ratio, again 10 for Britain, 10 for US and 6 for Japan, and was agreed for heavy cruisers, and a 10-10-7 ratio was agreed for destroyers. So even Navy would be controlled just like the battleships were earlier. Although parity between the US and Japan was allowed for submarines. So something was given to Japan that you could have the same number of submarines as the Americans. Michiko Hane notes that during the interwar period, disarmament became a source of discontent amongst the ultra-nationalists. So this entire idea that you should disarm, this is of course something that will happen in Germany as well, that the entire idea of the disarmament conference, but that also happened in Japan. There's a very famous David Lowe cartoon which shows how the Japanese were not interested in disarming at all. This became a source of discontent among the ultra-nationalists, and the signatories of the London Treaty were all targeted for assassination by right-wing militants. So there's a very clear idea that these are people who have done extreme wrong. Now, since this is a source-based paper, I will just read out to you as a part of activity 8 on this page, just some of the type of questions that can be asked. So there will be an extract that will be presented. So as you can see, there are two extracts which are presented. One is a secondary source. Source A is a secondary source, which is from a book published in 2014. And source B is an original source. It's a primary source, which is coming from an article in 1921. And what is the first question that you have in source A? What is meant by a certain phrase? So you are expected to explain with context the content which is given. As has already been mentioned, description of what is given in the source will fetch you absolutely no grades. You must add to this your own knowledge and your own understanding. Similarly, with reference to the origin, purpose and content, analyze the value and limitations of source B for a historian studying the impact of the Paris Peace Conference. So because it's written in 1921, can you analyze its impact, keeping in mind a historian who's studying the events of 1919. So this is through the usage of this kind of a textual help to you, or the anchoring to you, you have to, in that light, you have to look at the source and its value and limitations. You don't have to describe the value and limitations generally. You have to keep yourself as a historian who's studying 1919 and then talk about the values and limitations. And finally, compare and contrast the views expressed in both sources on Japanese views on racial equality. So again, running commentary, similarities and differences, but the key is Japanese view on racial equality. It's very important to read the question carefully as you apply the skills. You may have the skills of finding out similarities and differences, but are you able to apply it to the question of racial equality from the perspective of Japan as present in the two sources? That is where the grading will be done. We will of course look at this in much greater detail as we will have a later video breaking down each and every one of these four questions. But for now, this is the key that you need to remember. We will return very soon, this time with a new topic, but the saga of the continuing causes of Japanese expansion will stay with us here at nailib.com. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video, and thank you so much.